Those who can't remember the past are condemned to have it resold to them forever. Tonight, we explore the life of arguably the most important leftist thinker of the 21st century, a man who explained why your depression isn't your fault, why the future feels cancelled, and why we can imagine the end of the world, but not the end of capitalism. His name was Mark Fisher. To some, he was a prophet of our cultural malaise, the theorist who gave us the words to describe what we all felt but couldn't articulate. When you wonder why every movie is a remake, or why politics feels like choosing between different flavors of the same thing, Fisher had answers to both. He showed us how capitalism had colonized not just our economy, but our imagination itself. His writings explained why we're nostalgic for futures that never arrived, and he taught a generation that their personal struggles were symptoms of a broken system, not personal failures or character flaws, but the inevitable result of living in a world where the future itself had been cancelled. His death in January 2017 sent shockwaves through intellectual circles. The man who'd taught us that mental illness was a social problem couldn't save himself from its grip. Yet his ideas live on and remain more relevant than ever before. Today, as we scroll through endless content that feels both new and exhaustingly familiar, and as young people report feeling hopeless at rates never before recorded, Fisher's analysis cuts deeper with each passing year. Before we begin tonight's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing to History After Dark. It really helps others discover these explorations. And which historical figure would you like to learn about in an upcoming episode? Let me know in the comments below. Now, settle in as we begin to explore the life of the man who named our condition and fought to imagine something beyond it, even as that condition consumed him. This is the story of the life, work, and legacy of Mark Fisher. Chapter 1. The slogan that defined an era. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The phrase hits differently when you really think about it. Mark Fisher wielded these words like a diagnostic tool, probing at something specific about our 21st century condition. A malaise that surrounds us like air, so pervasive we've forgotten we're breathing it. We could picture humanity wiped out by nuclear war, climate catastrophe, pandemic. Those scenarios come easily to mind, but a world without buying and selling, without wages and profits, the imagination stalls. Fisher called this condition capitalist realism, the widespread sense that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, and that it's now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, capitalism lost its visible antagonists. It didn't have to defend itself anymore. It simply became the horizon of the imaginable, all the more powerful because it didn't need to be named, like water to a fish, invisible and total, To understand what this means, Fisher turned to Alfonso Cuarón's 2006 film, Children of Men. Picture Battersea Power Station transformed into a private museum for the ultra-wealthy. Inside, Michelangelo's David stands pristine. Picasso's Guernica hangs on the wall. Cultural treasures hoarded by elites while the world collapses around them. No children have been born for 18 years. Humanity faces literal extinction. The museum keeper has one response to this apocalypse. I try not to think about it. Fisher saw this as the perfect illustration of our current moment. Culture can no longer justify itself through future generations, since there won't be any. All that remains is nihilistic hedonism. Keep collecting, keep consuming. Try not to think about what comes next. The dystopia in Children of Men operates as an extrapolation of our world. Internment camps and franchise coffee bars coexist. The world doesn't end with a bang, Fisher observed. It winks out, unravels, gradually falls apart. Mass sterility becomes a metaphor for cultural sterility. How long can a culture persist without the new? What happens if the young are no longer capable of producing surprises? We're living through that answer now. The 2008 financial crisis should have been capitalism's death blow. The most spectacular failure of a political project ever, probably. Banks collapsed. Governments bailed them out with public money. The system revealed itself as a massive con. And yet, nothing changed. The left failed to capitalize on capitalism's failure because, by then, capitalist realism had already colonized our minds. Fisher traced this condition back through history, using Marx's own words from the Communist Manifesto. Capital has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. This process strips away old beliefs and rituals. What remains is the consumer spectator, trudging through the ruins and the relics. Everything becomes content, becomes product. Even our dissatisfaction gets packaged and sold back to us. Think about WALL-E, that Pixar film that critiques consumption while being consumed. We watch corporate anti-capitalism and feel like we've done something. The critique becomes the pacifier. The power of this realism lies in how it masquerades as protection, a shield against the supposed dangers of belief and fanaticism. The philosopher Alain Badiou captured this cynical logic perfectly. Sure, they say, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky that we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. Fisher recognized this deflationary perspective for what it was. The the worldview of a depressive who believes that any positive state, any hope, is a dangerous illusion. He knew this territory intimately. Depression had been his companion since his teenage years. He understood how it convinces you that your grey reality is the only reality, that seeing clearly means seeing hopelessly. The personal and the political merged in his analysis. Your individual depression and the collective depression of a society that can't imagine alternatives feed each other, creating a closed loop of despair. Capital is an abstract parasite, Fisher wrote, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into dead labor is ours, and the zombies it makes are us. How this loop formed, how Fisher learned to see it, and how he fought to break it, that's the story we need to tell. And it begins in an unlikely place, a conservative working-class home in the East Midlands, where a boy would find his revolutionary education in the pages of music magazines. Chapter 2. An Education by Newsprint. Mark was born in 1968 into a working-class family in the East Midlands. His parents were politically conservative. This detail matters. Fisher grew up inside the very demographic that would become a key pillar of the Thatcherite revolution. The aspirational working class that, disillusioned with the perceived failures of post-war social democracy, embraced a new narrative of individualism and market logic. This intimate proximity to working-class conservatism gave Fisher a perspective unavailable to many academic leftists. He could never indulge in simplistic, romanticized nostalgia for a unified proletariat. He knew from his own kitchen table that the working class was a site of complex and often contradictory desires. His political project became a rebellion against the political common sense of his own origins. This internal conflict fueled the unique combination of subtlety and vehemence in his writing on class. In a household with limited access to high culture, Fisher found his education in an unlikely place. The chaotic pages of the British music press, particularly the New Musical Express. The NME of the late 70s and early 80s was a volatile and thrilling mix of music, politics, film, fiction, and continental philosophy. A review of a post-punk band might sit alongside references to Jacques Derrida or Jean Baudrillard. For the teenage Fisher, this was his unorthodox education. The music press taught him that pop culture could be a site of profound political and aesthetic meaning. It also taught him the legitimacy, the necessity of being judgmental, a refusal of the bland cultural relativism that would come to dominate our era. This laid the foundation for what Fisher would call popular modernism, the moments in post-war mass culture when experimental, future-oriented energies of modernism broke into the mainstream. Cultural artifacts that sought to create new worlds rather than simply reflect existing ones. Fisher believed these eruptions of the culturally new and alien could instill the confidence that change was possible in other areas of life. His focus on music, film, and television was always a search for the tools of political transformation. Culture wasn't separate from politics. It was the laboratory where new forms of consciousness were developed, tested, and distributed. The music press of his youth showed him that theory could be smuggled into everyday life through a 3-minute pop song. That revolution might begin on the dance floor as much as the factory floor. But this optimism about culture's revolutionary potential would soon collide with a darker realization. The future itself was disappearing. Chapter 3: The Slow Cancellation of the Future. Mark Fisher had a simple test. Imagine beaming any piece of music from 2014 back to 1994, just 20 years. What would happen if people in 1994 heard it? Would they say, "My God, this is inexplicable. I've never heard anything like this"? Fisher didn't think so. They'd probably say, "Are you serious? This is coming from 20 years in the future? This doesn't sound that different from what we've got today." Now try the reverse. Beam music from 1994 back to 1974. The vast sonic worlds that had been born and died in that period. The enormous series of mutations that had occurred. Or go from 74 back to 54. The speed, the rapidity, the efflorescence of different sounds, different sensations that emerged in those periods. Each decade brought sounds that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. Fisher took a term from philosopher Jacques Derrida and made it his own: hauntology. We're familiar with being haunted by the past, but Fisher's concept was more specific. We're haunted by lost futures. The futures that the 20th century promised but never delivered. The feeling that the future itself has been cancelled, leaving us stuck in an endless loop of repetition. Franco Berardi called it the slow cancellation of the future, a phrase that captures both the termination and its gradual nature. The future didn't disappear overnight. It withered. It drained away. This cultural condition flows directly from capitalist realism. If there's no alternative to capitalism, then there's no real future, only a perpetual present, endlessly remixing and rebooting the past. Fisher argued that the failure of the future was constitutive of a postmodern cultural scene, which would become dominated by pastiche and revivalism. The problem became clear around 2003 or 4. Our expectations of music declined. This flattening out of time became naturalized. We stopped expecting music to sound like a radical break from the past. In the 90s, with genres like jungle and drum and bass, you felt something radically unprecedented. Music that felt like nothing you'd heard before, nor could you have heard it before. There was a feeling of the future rushing in toward us. That's almost entirely gone now. The sense of the futuristic now belongs to the past. It hasn't been updated since the 90s, really. When we use the word futuristic today, it's like the word Gothic. It refers to an already existing set of generic protocols, like a font. Futuristic means it sounds a bit like craftwork. It doesn't refer to an actual future impinging on the present. It refers to a set of associations that have been eternalized. Think about the radical shock of the new that characterized the shifts between the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Each decade brought sounds, styles, and possibilities that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. Compare that to now. For most young people today, Fisher wrote, the lack of alternatives to capitalism is no longer even an issue. Capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. What was the sound of 2005? What is the sound of 2008? These years fade into one another. But ask about 1975, and even if you weren't alive, you've probably got a sense of what it sounded like. Kurt Cobain embodied this cultural impasse. Fisher saw him as giving wearied voice to the despondency of the generation that had come after history, whose every move was anticipated, tracked, bought and sold before it had even happened. Cobain knew that he was just another piece of spectacle, that nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. Knew that his every move was a cliché, scripted in advance. Knew that even realizing it is a cliché. Success becomes another form of failure, since to succeed would only mean that you were the new meat on which the system could feed. Fisher called this precorporation. We've moved beyond the old dynamic where subversive culture gets absorbed by the mainstream. Now desires, aspirations, and hopes are preemptively formatted and shaped by capitalist culture. Alternative and independent don't designate something outside mainstream culture. They are styles, in fact, the dominant styles, within the mainstream. Everything is anticipated, bought, and sold before it even happens. Nothing ever really dies, but that's not good. We're assailed on all sides by zombie forms which persist forever. Revivals. Anything can come back. Fisher invoked T.S. Eliot to capture the melancholic heart of hauntology. Eliot's claim was that the exhaustion of the future does not even leave us with the past. Tradition counts for nothing when it is no longer contested and modified. A culture that is merely preserved is no culture at all. We live in a cultural museum where everything has already happened and nothing new is possible. This is the effective signature of a world gripped by capitalist realism, the endless present, cycling through dead forms, unable to produce genuine surprise. And for Fisher, this cultural stagnation was inseparable from a more personal affliction. The cancellation of the future was written on the bodies and minds of those living through it. Chapter 4: The Politics of Depression. Fisher wrote about his depression with unflinching honesty. It had plagued him since his teenage years, and it led to periods of self-harm and psychiatric hospitalization. He linked his conviction of being literally good for nothing to the social and psychic wounds of his class background, the feeling of being an imposter in the academic world, a dilettante who had somehow faked his way through. For Fisher, theory was never abstract. It was a tool for survival. Fisher identified something he called the privatization of stress. Neoliberal capitalism takes systemic problems and makes them appear as individual psychological failings. Rising inequality, precarious employment, crushing debt, the intense pressure to perform. If you're anxious or depressed, you're told the problem is a chemical imbalance in your brain, a flaw in your personal history. The system that creates these pressures remains invisible. The focus shifts from political causes to the individual who suffers. Fisher saw profound danger in how mental health was being depoliticized in this way. Capitalist realism insists on treating mental health as if it were a natural fact, like weather. But then again, weather is no longer a natural fact so much as a political, economic effect. In the 1960s and 70s, radical theory and politics coalesced around extreme mental conditions such as schizophrenia, arguing that madness was a political category. What is needed now is a politicization of much more common disorders. Indeed, it is their very commonness which is the issue. In Britain, depression is now the condition that is most treated by the National Health Service. This medicalization serves capital twice over. First, it reinforces individualism. You are sick because of your brain chemistry. Second, it opens a lucrative market in which multinational pharmaceutical companies can peddle their pharmaceuticals. Even if depression is neurologically instantiated as low serotonin, that says nothing about its cause. To understand why so many people have low serotonin requires a social and political explanation. The pharmaceutical response to mass depression mirrors the broader logic of capitalism. Problems generated by the system get sold back to us as individual solutions. Antidepressants become another consumer product, promising to restore our ability to function within the very structures that made us sick. Fisher knew this intimately. His own struggles with medication, therapy, and the mental health system gave him insight into how capitalism manages its human wreckage, how it patches people up just enough to keep them productive, while never addressing the underlying causes of their distress. Fisher performed the very act of deprivatization he called for. He took his private pain and made it the subject of public analysis on his blog. His work challenges us to ask the vital question he posed in capitalist realism. How has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill? For Fisher, this was a political question. His project was to convert privatized disaffection into politicized anger, breaking the cycle of isolation that is depression's core mechanism. But understanding depression as political was only the beginning. Fisher's life would soon provide him with an even starker lesson in how power shapes reality itself. Chapter 5. The Hillsborough Trauma. On April 15th, 1989, Fisher was 20 years old. A supporter of Nottingham Forest Football Club, he stood in the stands at Hillsborough Stadium for an FA Cup semi-final against Liverpool. The day started like any other match day. Excitement in the air. Fans streaming toward the ground. The anticipation of 90 minutes of football. Then everything changed. Due to catastrophic failures in police crowd management, a crush developed in the Liverpool supporters' pens. 96 people died. Fisher was there. He saw it happen. The immediate aftermath was chaos. fans tearing down advertising boards to use as makeshift stretchers, people trying desperately to save lives while police formed cordons instead of helping. The scale of the disaster became clear, gradually, horribly. Bodies laid out on the pitch, families searching for loved ones. The stadium transformed from a place of sport into a scene of mass death. What followed was as horrific as the event itself. Within hours, a systematic campaign began. Police and state apparatus, with active help from sections of the media, constructed a false narrative. They blamed the victims, drunken, ticketless fans forcing their way into the stadium, Liverpool supporters stealing from the dead, attacking police officers who were trying to help. The Sun newspaper printed these lies as fact under the headline, "The Truth." The bereaved families lived with this fabrication for decades. Fisher described this experience as an epistemological rupture, a fundamental break in his understanding of how knowledge, truth, and reality are constructed. Hillsborough demonstrated viscerally how state power operates against the working class, how official narratives are constructed to obscure and distort material reality. The police changed their statements. Senior officers orchestrated a cover-up. The coroner limited the scope of inquests. Every institution that should have pursued truth instead participated in burying it. The conflict was between two opposing realities. The official story was a deliberate fiction designed to protect the state from accountability. The lived reality of the victims and survivors was actively suppressed and vilified for decades. Families who knew their loved ones had been sober, had held tickets, had died because of police incompetence, were forced to hear those same loved ones slandered in the press and in Parliament. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was conscious, deliberate, ideological warfare waged by the state against a working-class community. This event cemented Fisher's deep-seated suspicion of authority. It provided a concrete, personal anchor for his later critiques of the invisible ideological frameworks that constrain our reality. He had seen with his own eyes how power could fabricate an entire reality to serve its own interests, how the truth could be buried under official lies for 23 years, until the Hillsborough Independent Panel finally vindicated the families in 2012. This visceral lesson from his youth would inform his intellectual project for the rest of his life. The trauma of Hillsborough taught Fisher that reality itself could be contested terrain, that the stories we tell about what happened matter as much as what actually happened. This understanding would drive him deeper into theory, searching for tools to decode and resist these mechanisms of control. In the 90s, he would find those tools in the strangest of places, a rogue philosophy collective at Warwick University that was about to blow apart the boundaries between theory and fiction. Chapter 6: Cybernetic Futures and a Fork in the Road. In the 1990s, at the University of Warwick, Fisher became a founding member of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. The CCRU operated on the fringes of the philosophy department, less a formal academic body than a radical thought collective led by philosophers Sadie Plant and Nick Land. They met in cramped offices and student flats, fueled by amphetamines and endless discussions that blurred the line between rigorous philosophy and fevered speculation. They welded together the post-structuralism of Deleuze and Guattari with the cyberpunk aesthetics of William Gibson and J.G. Ballard, the occultism of Aleister Crowley, and the frenetic, futuristic rhythms of jungle and drum and bass music. The C.C.R.U. wasn't just studying culture. They were trying to summon new realities into being. They developed their own vocabulary, their own mythology. Theory fiction collapsed the distinction between theoretical analysis and speculative narrative. Hyperstition described fictions or ideas that make themselves real through cultural feedback loops. They wrote in a style that was part academic paper, part science fiction, part occult transmission. The initial politics of the CCRU, heavily influenced by Nick Land, embraced an exuberant anti-politics, a pro-markets, anti-capitalism line that celebrated the deterritorializing flows of capital as a positive force for dissolving old social structures. Capital was seen as an alien intelligence, reprogramming human society for its own mysterious ends. This was the seed of what would later become right accelerationism. Land was their Nietzsche, a figure who baited progressive pieties with brilliant provocations. Fisher was initially swept up in this intellectual fervor, this sense that they were decoding reality itself. After the CCRU dissolved amid exhaustion and institutional pressure, Land's thought veered into what he termed the Dark Enlightenment, a neo-reactionary philosophy that embraced anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian positions and scientific racism. For Land, capital became the only true agent in modern history. Humans were merely its meat puppets or temporary hosts. Democracy was a virus to be eliminated. His writing grew darker, colder, more explicitly hostile to any form of human solidarity. His work became a key inspiration for the alt-right movement, providing intellectual scaffolding for their tech-fascist fantasies. Fisher's trajectory diverged dramatically. His real-world experiences teaching in the public sector in the early 2000s forced a profound re-evaluation of the CCRU's abstract theories. Standing in front of exhausted students, navigating endless bureaucratic assessments, watching how neoliberalism ground down both teachers and learners, Fisher came to see that the system was generating pervasive, decentralized bureaucracy and psychic misery. The collision between heady theory and drab reality precipitated his conscious turn towards committed leftism and a definitive break from Land's politics. Fisher sought to reclaim accelerationism for the left, founding what became known as left accelerationism. The premise was that technologies and processes unleashed by capitalism could be repurposed for emancipatory, post-capitalist ends. The infrastructure of modernity didn't have to serve capital. It could be seized, and redirected toward collective flourishing. The schism with land was foundational. It allowed Fisher to define his own political project against the dark, anti-humanist trajectory of his former collaborator. This break would lead him to confront one of the most difficult questions facing any anti-capitalist project. If capitalism has colonized our very desires, how can we even begin to want something different? 1:5. Chapter 7. Post-Capitalist Desire. Conservative politician Louise Mensch once ridiculed Occupy protesters for decrying capitalism while using iPhones and drinking Starbucks coffee. Fisher argued that while the critique was cynical, it pointed to a real and difficult question. To what extent is our desire for post-capitalism already captured and neutralized by capitalism itself? The protesters wanted a different world, but they wanted it through the very technologies and pleasures that capitalism provided. This wasn't hypocrisy, though. It was the fundamental trap of our moment. Fisher firmly rejected any politics based on moralistic austerity or reactionary striving for pre-capitalist primitivism. The idea that we should abandon modern technology, return to the land, live without the conveniences of contemporary life. This was a losing strategy precisely because capitalism is so deeply intertwined with pleasure and desire. Fisher's position? The left cannot win by telling people to want less. The sexual and emotional attractions of consumer capitalism, what theorists call its libidinal pull, must be met with something equally attractive. By libidinal, Fisher meant the deep psychological forces that drive our desires, our pleasures, our sense of what feels good and exciting. Capitalism doesn't just control our wallets, it shapes what turns us on, literally and figuratively. Fisher engaged with his former mentor Nick Land to explore the depth of this problem. Land argued that capital and desire are so fundamentally entangled that any attempt to separate them is futile. For land capital is a tendency we are completely immersed in. Cyberspace is already under our skin. We don't use technology. Technology uses us, reprograms us, makes us into components of its own expansion. Think about how you feel when your phone dies. That anxiety, that sense of being cut off from something vital, that's what land meant. The technology has become part of our nervous system. Fisher rejected Land's dark, anti-humanist political conclusions, but insisted the left would be remiss to ignore the challenge Land posed. If we're honest, we have to admit that capitalism has successfully installed itself as the infrastructure of human pleasure and desire. Our fantasies, our aspirations, our sense of what makes life worth living all run through its circuits. The smartphone has become like an organ of our body, with social media its nervous system, the way we process social reality. Consumer goods become material through which we construct who we are. The task is to go all the way through capitalist modernity, repurposing its technological and social infrastructure to build something new, seizing the desires that capitalism generates but can never truly satisfy. desires for real connection that social media promises but delivers only as addiction and anxiety. You're not part of a neighborhood anymore. You're part of the Apple ecosystem or the Nike family. These authentic human needs point beyond capitalism, toward forms of life that capital can only simulate and exploit. Post-capitalist desire requires understanding how deeply capitalism shapes what we want. Our dreams of success, our visions of the good life, even our fantasies of escape all bear capitalism's fingerprints. When you imagine freedom, you probably imagine having enough money to quit your job. When you imagine happiness, it probably involves buying things. Fisher knew that building an alternative meant more than changing economic structures. It meant rewiring the desire-producing mechanisms that capitalism had installed in our heads, creating new circuits of pleasure and possibility. The question haunted his work. How do we make people want a world beyond capitalism when capitalism has taught us what wanting means? The answer would emerge from an unlikely source, a viral moment in British media that would push Fisher to write his most controversial essay. Chapter 8: The Catalyst for the Vampire Castle. In the summer of 2013, Fisher described feeling exhausted through overwork and increasingly dejected by the miserable, dispiriting zone of left-wing Twitter. He saw it dominated by an atmosphere of snarky resentment and witch-hunting moralism. The online left had become a circular firing squad, more interested in destroying its own than building anything new. Fisher watched this dynamic with growing despair. Two specific events served as catalysts. The first was the relentless online criticism directed at journalist Owen Jones. Jones was a young working-class writer who had broken into mainstream media with his book Chavs, about the demonization of the working class in Britain. He regularly appeared on television, wrote for major newspapers, and reached audiences that most left-wing academics could only dream of. Fisher identified Jones as the person most responsible for raising class consciousness in the UK in the last few years. Yet the attacks came primarily from within the left. They criticized him for being too moderate, for appearing on mainstream media, for making compromises, for not being radical enough. Every word he wrote was scrutinized for ideological impurity. Fisher saw this as a powerful deterrent against any leftist attempting to engage with the mainstream. If this is what happens to a left-winger who is actually succeeding in taking the struggle to the center ground of British life, why would anyone want to follow him? The message was clear: stay pure, stay marginal, or be destroyed by your own side. This negative online dynamic was thrown into sharp relief by a positive, real-world experience. Fisher attended a People's Assembly meeting in Ipswich. He praised the event as a successful fusion of vertical media power, which drew new people in, and horizontal grassroots organizing. The atmosphere was anti-racist and anti-sexist, but refreshingly free of the paralyzing feeling of guilt and suspicion which hangs over left-wing Twitter like an acrid, stifling fog. Real people in a real room working toward real change. The contrast with online discourse couldn't have been starker. The final detonation point came in October 2013. Now disgraced comedian Russell Brand appeared on Newsnight, the BBC's flagship political programme, with Jeremy Paxman, Britain's most feared political interviewer. Paxman was known for his aggressive questioning style, his ability to humiliate politicians, his embodiment of establishment authority. Brand, a working-class comedian with a history of addiction and recovery, shouldn't have stood a chance. But Fisher watched Brand demolish Paxman's condescension. With intelligence and wit, Brand spoke passionately about inequality, about the pointlessness of voting when all parties serve the same interests, about the need for revolution. He articulated the rage and frustration of millions who felt locked out of politics. He made revolution sound not only necessary but possible. The reaction from what Fisher termed the moralizing left immediately pivoted the discourse to condemnations of Brand's personal history of sexism and misogynistic humor. Fisher saw this as a deliberate deflection, a way to neutralize a potent class-based political moment by shifting the focus to individual moral failings. The perfect became the enemy of the good. The opportunity for mass political awakening was sacrificed on the altar of moral purity. Fisher recognized a pattern emerging. Every time someone broke through, every time a working-class voice gained a platform, every time momentum began to build, the same dynamic kicked in: the call-out, the denunciation, the demand for perfect political credentials, the reduction of complex political figures to their worst moments. This wasn't activism. It was a kind of anti-politics that made organizing impossible. Fisher had seen enough. He needed to name this phenomenon, to analyze it, to understand how the left had become its own worst enemy. The essay that resulted would become his most controversial piece of writing. It would split opinions, destroy friendships, and haunt him until his death. But Fisher believed it needed to be written. The future of left politics depended on it. Chapter 9: Exiting the Vampire Castle. Fisher wrote his most controversial essay after watching the online left tear itself apart. He called the phenomenon the Vampire Castle. The name was deliberately gothic, deliberately dramatic. Like vampires, these dynamics sucked the life out of movements. Like a castle, they created an enclosed, hierarchical space where certain people held power over others. But the Vampire Castle wasn't a place or an organization. It was a pattern of behavior that had infected left-wing politics, especially online. To understand what Fisher meant, imagine this scenario. A working-class comedian goes on television and speaks passionately about revolution, inequality, and the need for change. Millions of ordinary people watch and feel inspired. Finally, someone is saying what they've been thinking, but within hours, the online left shifts the conversation. Instead of building on this momentum, they're dissecting the comedian's past jokes, his treatment of women, his problematic language. The opportunity for mass political awakening gets sacrificed on the altar of moral purity. Fisher identified 3 psychological drives behind the Vampire Castle. First, a priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, the pleasure of declaring someone a sinner, casting them out, being the one who upholds moral standards. Second, an academic pedant's desire to be the first to spot a mistake, the rush of being the smartest person in the room, catching the error everyone else missed. Third, a hipster's desire to be one of the in crowd, the need to know the right words, the right positions, to be on the right side while others are exposed as frauds. These desires created what Fisher called the 5 laws of the vampire castle. The first law was to individualize and privatize everything. Take climate change. Instead of demanding systemic change, we're told to drive less, recycle more, reduce our personal carbon footprint. The massive corporations pumping carbon into the atmosphere disappear from view. It becomes your fault for not biking to work. The system that makes cars necessary vanishes behind individual moral failure. The second law was to make thought and action appear impossibly difficult. Every statement needs endless qualifiers. Every action requires months of deliberation. Humor becomes suspect because it's not serious enough. Confidence gets reframed as arrogance. Having strong convictions means you're one step away from becoming Stalin. The result is paralysis. Nothing can be done because everything might be problematic. The third law was to propagate guilt. The more guilty everyone feels, the better. Guilt becomes proof that you understand how bad things are. If you're privileged in any way, you must perform your guilt constantly, and you must make others feel guilty too. It's a kind of emotional pyramid scheme where everyone is trying to make everyone else feel worse about themselves. The fourth law was to essentialize. This means reducing people to fixed categories. Someone makes one problematic comment and forever becomes a sexist. A single mistake defines their entire character. There's no room for growth, learning, or context. Meanwhile, the accusers maintain perfect flexibility for themselves. They can evolve, change, make mistakes, but their enemies are frozen in amber at their worst moment. The fifth law was to think like a liberal while claiming to be radical. The vampire castle would endlessly point out that capitalism is bad, that powerful people abuse their power, that oppression exists. But these observations never led to strategies for taking power or changing structures. Just endless cataloguing of injuries and performance of righteousness. Protest without the possibility of transformation. Fisher argued that the vampire castle had replaced class politics with something else entirely. Instead of fighting to abolish the class system, people were fighting for recognition within it. Instead of solidarity across difference, there was competition for who was most oppressed. The mention of class itself became suspicious, as if talking about economic inequality meant you were trying to ignore racism or sexism. But Fisher argued the opposite was happening. Race and gender were being used to hide class. Social media amplified these dynamics exponentially. What had once been confined to certain academic or activist spaces now had no boundaries. Twitter's character limit made nuance impossible. Facebook's algorithm rewarded outrage over analysis. Context collapsed. Jokes became evidence. Screenshots became weapons. Everyone was watching everyone else for signs of impurity. The fear was constant. Say the wrong thing and you could be next. Fisher stated explicitly that he was attacking neither feminism nor anti-racism. He was targeting what he saw as a bourgeois liberal perversion and appropriation of the energy of these movements. The Vampire Castle took the radical potential of liberation movements and converted it into a game of moral one-upmanship, a competition to be the most oppressed, the most aware, the most pure. This created a hierarchy of suffering that paradoxically reinforced the very structures it claimed to oppose. The solution Fisher proposed was both simple and difficult. Learn to build comradeship and solidarity instead of condemning and abusing each other. Create spaces where people can disagree without fear of excommunication. Accept that people make mistakes and can learn from them. Focus on building collective power rather than performing individual virtue. Remember that the goal is to destroy the class system, not to achieve recognition within it. Fisher knew the essay would be controversial. He was attacking sacred cows, naming dynamics that many had noticed but few dared to discuss openly. He was prepared for backlash from the right, from liberals, from the mainstream media. What he wasn't fully prepared for was the scale of the reaction from within the left itself. The essay wouldn't just spark debate, it would detonate like a bomb in the middle of an already fractious movement. Outside the Vampire Castle, anything is possible, he'd written. He was about to find out what happened when you tried to leave. Chapter 10. The Firestorm. The essay ignited a firestorm across the left-leaning blogosphere and social media. Jacobin magazine would later call it Fisher's most loved and hated essay. Within hours of publication, battle lines were drawn. Comment sections exploded. Twitter became a war zone. The left split into camps, and everyone had to pick a side. Critics came out swinging. The essay was misogynistic and anti-feminist, they said. Fisher was providing a convenient shield for public figures like Russell Brand, while dismissing legitimate feminist critiques of their behavior. He was promoting class reductionism, trying to impose a homogeneous working class that erased the specific oppressions faced by women, people of color, and queer individuals. The attacks got personal. Fisher was just another middle-aged white dude whose privilege invalidated his critique. Anarchist writer Andrew Flood argued that Fisher had monsterized his opponents by casting them as vampires and witches. This rhetorical move excluded them from legitimate debate. What Fisher called witch hunting was actually call-out culture, an essential tool for marginalized people to challenge those with more power. The Gothic imagery of the Vampire Castle was itself a form of violence, dehumanizing those who were fighting for justice. Supporters saw it differently. For them, Fisher had powerfully articulated a widespread frustration with the toxic and unproductive nature of online discourse. He'd given voice to something many had felt but couldn't express, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the exhaustion of endless moral policing, the sense that the left was destroying itself while capital watched and laughed. Theorist Jody Dean argued the essay was a crucial extension of Fisher's capitalist realism thesis. The left's moralistic individualism was a symptom of neoliberal atomization and reflective impotence. We'd lost our collective, class-based project and were turning on each other instead. The Vampire Castle was capitalism's work being done from within. The master's tools being used to demolish the master's opposition. The personal toll on Fisher was severe. He was bombarded with accusations of misogyny and chauvinism, called a rape apologist, told he was enabling abuse. The very dynamics he'd described in the essay were now directed at him with full force. He withdrew from Twitter, unable to bear the constant attacks. Later, he confided to a friend something that confirmed his thesis. While he was being publicly excoriated, he'd received numerous private messages of support. People who agreed with him but felt unable to say so publicly. They feared becoming the next target. The culture of fear he'd diagnosed was real, and now he was living proof. The essay became a moment of splitting that would define the online left for years to come. It alienated many who felt their specific struggles were being dismissed or subordinated to class politics. Years of fighting for recognition, for their voices to be heard, seemed threatened by Fisher's argument. Yet it galvanized and solidified a large audience who felt he had named a crucial problem: the endless infighting, the circular firing squads, the replacement of strategy with moralism. The controversy remains a reference point for understanding the fractures and anxieties of the contemporary left. Every few months, someone rediscovers the essay and the arguments begin again. The same positions get staked out. The same wounds get reopened. Fisher had wanted to exit the Vampire Castle. Instead, he'd become permanently associated with it. The essay would haunt him for the rest of his life, even as he tried to move beyond its terms towards something more constructive. Chapter 11. The Legacy of a Polemic. The Vampire Castle essay cast a long shadow over left-wing discourse. Years after publication, it became widely cited as a foundational text in critiques of what would later be called cancel culture. Fisher's diagnosis of moral puritanism, status seeking through condemnation, and individual scapegoating seemed remarkably prescient. Every new Twitter storm seemed to confirm his analysis. Every public shaming followed the script he'd outlined. The essay's influence proved politically promiscuous. The dirtbag left of the late 2010s embraced it as vindication of their deliberately provocative style. Podcasters and writers who rejected the polite conventions of liberal discourse claimed Fisher as their intellectual ancestor. Yet his critique of left shrillness was also appropriated by figures on the right, who used it to dismiss any criticism of racism or sexism as Vampire Castle behavior. The essay became a weapon in culture wars Fisher would have found depressing. Friends and close readers insist Fisher would have been embarrassed by how his arguments were later weaponized by self-pitying reactionaries who simply felt aggrieved at being criticized. He wasn't arguing against accountability or against fighting oppression. He was diagnosing specific dynamics that made solidarity impossible. The difference mattered, even if it got lost in the endless recycling of his ideas by people who'd never read his other work. Fisher himself sought to move beyond the purely negative and polemical mode of the essay. He knew that diagnosing a problem wasn't enough. You had to build alternatives. His final, unfinished project, Acid Communism, represented this constructive turn. He pivoted to embrace the feminist practice of consciousness raising as a model for building new forms of solidarity that could articulate the struggles of all minority positions with a renewed politics of class. Consciousness raising needed explanation for those unfamiliar with its history. Originating in second-wave feminism, it was a practice of collective discussion, where participants discovered that what felt like personal, individual problems were actually shared structural issues. The shame you felt about your body wasn't your private failing. It was patriarchy. The exhaustion you felt at work wasn't your weakness. It was capitalism. Through these discussions, a new collective subject emerged, a new we that was both the agent of struggle and the thing being struggled for. This turn to feminist methodology showed that Fisher wasn't dismissing struggles based on gender or race. He was actively searching for a framework that could connect them to a broader, universalist class project. The very solidarity he found lacking in the Vampire Castle could be built through the methods feminists had developed decades earlier. Consciousness raising created the conditions where people could recognize their shared interests without erasing their differences. The move represented a significant shift from negative critique of the left's failings to positive proposals for its reconstruction. Fisher was trying to answer his own question. If the Vampire Castle was the problem, what was the solution? How could the left build power rather than eating itself? How could it create movements that welcomed people in rather than driving them away? The answer lay in practices that transformed individual suffering into collective power. The Vampire Castle essay was never meant to be Fisher's final word. It was ground clearing for a more hopeful and constructive political vision. He wanted to exit the castle, to build something better outside its walls. The tragedy was that he wouldn't live to complete this project, but the direction he'd indicated remained. From ruthless criticism of everything existing to patient construction of the new, from tearing down to building up. Chapter 12. Acid Communism, Reclaiming Lost Futures. Fisher's final project bore a provocative title, Acid Communism. The name was designed to explode the dreary, grey stereotypes of communism by fusing it with the expansive, psychedelic consciousness of the counterculture. It pointed toward a future that was joyful, creative, and strange, a communism that could make you dance. Fisher argued that the last 40 years have been a protracted counter-revolution against the radical possibilities that opened up in the late 1960s and early 70s. Neoliberalism is best understood as a project aimed at destroying to the point of making them unthinkable the experiments in democratic socialism and libertarian communism that were efflorescing at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. This counter-revolution was aimed at exorcising what philosopher Herbert Marcuse called the spectre of a world which could be free, the imminent possibility of a life beyond scarcity and meaningless work, a world of collective flourishing and autonomous creativity. Acid communism sought to recover the potentials that were materialized and democratized in that period before they were suppressed. Fisher wanted to achieve the convergence of class consciousness, socialist, feminist, consciousness-raising and psychedelic consciousness, the fusion of new social movements with a communist project, an unprecedented aestheticization of everyday life. This wasn't nostalgia for bell-bottoms and flower power. It was about recovering a lost confidence that everything could be different. The early 1970s saw a new kind of worker emerge. Influenced by the counterculture, they began making demands for a better quality of life and an end to drudgery. Work refusal became a mass phenomenon. Absenteeism skyrocketed. Factory workers slowed production lines. Office workers extended lunch breaks into the afternoon. People began to ask why automation should mean unemployment rather than freedom from work. Why machines couldn't liberate us all rather than making most of us redundant. Fisher saw this potential most clearly in the autonomia movement in Italy in 1977. A mass avant-garde of students and young workers demanded zero work for income and the automation of all production. They occupied universities and factories. They created free radio stations and underground newspapers. They organized festivals that were simultaneously protests and parties. For a brief moment, it seemed like a new world was being born. Young people who had grown up with the counterculture's expanded consciousness were refusing to accept capitalism's narrow reality. Acid communism was Fisher's ultimate answer to capitalist realism. It attempted to re-politicize desire, providing a compelling vision of a post-capitalist future, a world where technology served human flourishing rather than capital accumulation, where creativity was unleashed rather than commodified, where consciousness expansion was a collective project rather than an individual escape. His goal was an act of unforgetting, a counter-exorcism of the spectre of a world which could be free. The manuscript remained unfinished at his death, but the questions it posed remain urgent. What happened to our capacity to imagine radically different futures? How was the confidence of that revolutionary moment converted into our current paralysis? And how might we recover that lost sense of possibility? 1:5. Chapter 14. Consciousness. Deflation. If the spectre of a free world seemed so imminent in the 70s, why did it disappear? Fisher's answer was that it was deliberately destroyed. A vast social, political, and cultural project was enacted with the explicit aim of the production of scarcity. artificial scarcity of time, security, and resources, designed to distract us from the imminent possibility of freedom. Fisher called this process consciousness deflation. What has shifted beyond all recognition since then is the existential and emotional atmosphere. Populations are resigned to the sadness of work, even as they are told that automation is making their jobs disappear. We must regain the optimism of that 70s moment, just as we must carefully analyze all the machineries that capital deployed to convert confidence into dejection. Understanding how this process of consciousness deflation worked is the first step to reversing it. The privatization of stress was a key tool of consciousness deflation. By making systemic problems feel like individual failings, it prevented the formation of a collective subject capable of fighting back. The epidemic of anxiety and depression that now grips the world isn't a coincidence or a medical mystery. It's the intended result of a successful, decades-long ideological war. Each person who feels politically hopeless, who can't imagine things being different, who accepts their misery as natural, is a small victory for this project. Culture played a crucial role in this process. The radical energies of the counterculture were neutralized and commodified. Those aspects of the counterculture which could be appropriated have been repurposed as precursors of the new spirit of capitalism, while those which were incompatible with a world of overwork have been condemned as so many idle doodles, which, in the contradictory logic of reaction, are simultaneously dangerous and impotent. Punk became a fashion statement. Rave became a licensed leisure industry. Revolution became a marketing strategy. Fisher traced how each subculture that emerged with transformative potential was systematically defanged. The music that once soundtracked social movements became background noise for shopping. The drugs that once expanded consciousness became tools for managing the stress of overwork. The communities that once offered alternatives to the nuclear family became networking opportunities. Every line of flight was recaptured and turned into a profit stream. The process was so thorough that most people now can't even imagine that things were ever different. The confidence of the 70s seems like a fairy tale from another world. Young people today have never known a time when the future seemed open, when work was optional, when revolution felt imminent. They've inherited a world where precarity is normal, where debt is expected, where depression is endemic. This learned helplessness is the ultimate triumph of consciousness deflation. Fisher insisted that understanding consciousness deflation as a political project was essential. Our collective feelings of dejection are the result of a long and successful campaign that can be contested and undone. The existential and emotional atmosphere we inhabit was manufactured, which means it can be dismantled and replaced. The first step is recognizing that our depression has a history. The second is understanding that history. The third would be writing a different ending, but that task would remain unfinished. Chapter 15. An Unfinished Project. Mark Fisher took his own life on January 13th, 2017, at the age of 48. His death was a profound loss for the intellectual and political communities he had nurtured. The news spread through the networks he had helped create. Former students, blog readers, fellow theorists, people who had never met him but felt they knew him through his writing. The outpouring of grief was immediate and vast. His close friend, Tariq Goddard, noted a devastating paradox. The immense generosity and care Fisher extended to his students, friends, and readers was a quality he tragically could not extend to himself. The man who had spent years analyzing collective depression, who had mapped the political machinery that produces despair, who had given so many people tools to understand their suffering, couldn't escape his own. His brilliant analysis of depression as a social and political phenomenon didn't provide a personal shield against the condition. To frame his life purely as a story of defeat would miss the point of his entire project. Theory was never an abstract game for Fisher. It was a weapon, a diagnostic tool, and a means of survival. He relentlessly attacked the notion of the purely personal, insisting that our deepest pains are interwoven with social and political structures. His own life stands as a powerful, poignant, and ultimately tragic testament to that very connection. The personal is political became more than a slogan. It was the truth he lived and died by. Fisher didn't leave behind settled doctrines or easy answers. He bequeathed a set of urgent, vital, and productively unresolved questions that remain at the heart of any attempt to build a viable left today. How can solidarity be built across difference without collapsing into fragmentation? How can technology be harnessed for liberation without reinforcing capital's logic? How can we build institutions that foster collective desire and intelligence? These questions aren't academic exercises. They're matters of survival for anyone trying to imagine and build alternatives to capitalism. Fisher's final words in Capitalist Realism serve as both conclusion and beginning. The long, dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. These words were a gift, a tool, a weapon, even an invitation. Fisher spent his life trying to wake us from the consensus trance of capitalist realism. His death doesn't end that project. It passes it to us. The question now is what we'll do with it.